Published in the spring of 1927, Being and Time was immediately recognized as an original and groundbreaking philosophical work. Reviewers compared it to an electric shock and a lightning strike, and there was praise for the philosophical brilliance and genius of its young author, Martin Heidegger. He was only 37 years old. Being and Time and Heidegger quickly became the focus of debates and controversy, as well as an inspiration for new impulses in thinking. Indeed, the publication of Being and Time was an intellectual event of such consequence that it seems right to describe it with a comment Gove made in another context. From here and today, a new epoch of world history sets forth. Prior to the publication of Being and Time, Heidegger had achieved some fame on the basis of his lecture courses at the University of Marburg. The courses were challenging and stimulating, and it is no accident that many of his students during these years would become original thinkers in their own right. Hannah Arendt later spoke of the rumor of a hidden king circulating among university students in Germany. Hans-Georg Gadamer described Heidegger's classes as an elemental event, in which the boldness and radicality of Heidegger's questioning took one's breath away. Among students at least, it was clear that during his years at Marburg, 1923–1928, Heidegger was laying the groundwork for a genuine philosophical revolution. But until the publication of Being and Time, that revolution remained only a rumor, since Heidegger had not published anything for a decade. Despite his renown as a teacher, this absence of publications placed enormous pressures upon Heidegger to finally bring into print the ideas that he had been developing in his lecture courses. The reason for this is clear. In 1925, Heidegger was passed over by the Ministry of Education for a promotion to Paul Nathorp's chair in philosophy at Marburg due to his lack of publication. Faced with this rejection, Heidegger worked intensely over the next year to finish the project of Being and Time until he was finally able to present a virtually complete manuscript to his teacher, Edmund Husserl, on Husserl's 67th birthday, April 8, 1926. Later that same year, Heidegger was again nominated for Nathorp's chair, and this time he submitted the galley proofs of Being and Time in support of his nomination. The Ministry of Education's response was to reject Heidegger's nomination yet again, returning the proofs of Being and Time with the comment, insufficient. After Being and Time was published a few months later, its reception made it abundantly clear that this genuinely new philosophical voice and viewpoint was destined to have a profound impact upon philosophy, and that Heidegger had indeed opened up a new path for thinking. In 1928, Husserl retired from teaching at the University of Freiburg, and Heidegger was offered Husserl's chair. Although Heidegger eventually received an offer from Marburg, he accepted the chance to move to Freiburg as Husserl's successor instead. One consequence of this pressure to publish was that Heidegger decided to publish Being and Time in installments rather than wait until the entire text was finished as he had outlined. The conception of the fundamental ontological project undertaken in Being and Time was, however, fully articulated from the outset. In Section 8 of the introduction, Heidegger outlines the plan of Being and Time as divided into two parts, each with three divisions. The first installment of the text that Heidegger published in 1927 consisted only of the first two divisions of the first part, 2/3 of the planned text, the last division of the first part, and the entire second part of the projected text were still to be written. Initially, Heidegger planned on completing the project of Being and Time as he had originally outlined it, but by 1929 or 1930, he had abandoned that plan. The text that we now have, and that stands as the complete text of Being and Time, is thus the incomplete version that was published in the spring of 1927. Heidegger announces this in his author's preface to the 7th German edition, 1953, when he writes, "The designation first half, which previous editions bore, has been deleted." After a quarter century, the second half could no longer be added without the first being presented anew. Nonetheless, its path still remains a necessary one even today if the question of being is to move our Dasein. Roman 27. What this means for one who sets out to read Being and Time is that this book needs to be understood as a torso of its own intentions and the fragment of a larger project. This poses a special interpretive problem. Since Being and Time continually rewrites itself, that is, since it repeatedly revisits earlier analyses in the light of their own conclusions, one needs to read it with this incompletion always in view. What was projected, even if never completed, was to have been the basis for a re-examination of the text that we do have. Although significant portions of its missing sections were eventually written and published elsewhere, the 1927 lecture course, the basic problems of phenomenology, is especially significant in this regard. Heidegger never attempted to complete being and time, and he made no clear effort to link the portions that were published elsewhere to the plan of being and time. And one bears in mind that being and time remains a fragment, that Heidegger never explicitly continued to work out the plan of that project, and that he never systematically incorporated the work he did there into his later work. One is left with a genuine question. Is the project of fundamental ontology laid out in being and time able to be carried out to completion? Or is it the case that this project cannot be completed according to the conditions that it sets for itself? Heidegger would ask this same question, even if only tacitly for many years. Heidegger's most extensive, significant, and explicit self-assessment of being and time is perhaps found in his contributions to philosophy of the event. There, as elsewhere, Heidegger's view was that the project of fundamental ontology as it was outlined in being and time could not, in the end, be completed. Indeed, it is striking that much of the vocabulary and structures that he so painstakingly developed in being and time would disappear from his work over the next decade. Despite this, Heidegger was both emphatic and unwavering in his insistence that working through the project of being and time, while coming to understand its insights and its limits, was a decisive and ineluctable step on the path that thinking needs to take in our time. Thus, while Heidegger never resumed this project, he never repudiated it either. On the contrary, he frequently returned to it as he re-examined and rethought his own path of thinking. Despite or even perhaps because of the aborted character of his aims in being and time, this book was a constant touchstone for Heidegger's own path of thinking, and it would become a landmark in the history of philosophy that continues to challenge us today. Being and time begins by referring to a doubled forgetfulness characterizing our historical present. We have not only forgotten the question of being sane and how to ask it, but this forgetting itself is no longer noticed. It too has been forgotten. This forgetting is not an error or a mistake that we can simply correct. One does not forget the question of being the way one forgets one's keys, nor is the question of being a question that one can ask in the form that most questions take. Rather, the sources of such a question, as well as the way it is forgotten, are, as Heidegger's analysis shows, rooted in our way of being. Factical life is necessarily bound up in a movement that conceals as well as reveals. The same structures that disclose factical life shrouded in obscurity. As Heidegger put it elsewhere, das Leben ist diesig, es nebelt sich immer wieder ein. Life is imminent and hazy, it always and again encloses itself in a fog. Although our way of being always involves us in the fog of forgetfulness which, for the most part, we do not even notice, our way of being equally involves us in opening up and clearing the question of being. Asking the question of what it means to be and not to be defines and distinguishes each of us and determines the way we live our lives. Our way of being in the world is shaped fundamentally, and in every respect, by the fact that each of us is always preoccupied with this question, even if it is not thematized as such and even when it is forgotten. Yet precisely because we have forgotten how to ask this question, and because we have become numb to what moves us to pose the question of being, the first and largest task of being and time is to recover and renew it. In order to do this, Heidegger undertakes a phenomenological analysis of that being who asks such a question, the being who is concerned about its own being sane, namely, Dasein. To this end, the published portion of the original plan of being and time contains the fundamental preparatory analysis of Dasein, Part 1, and the repetition of this analysis in the light of temporality, which the existential analytic had disclosed as the primordial meaning of Dasein's way of being, Part 2. The move from this analysis of the being of the questioner to the question of being itself was ultimately never carried out. No brief summary of either this analysis or its repetition can ever be adequate to the range and subtlety of being and time. The sweep of Heidegger's analysis here is stunning. Truth, death, anxiety, praxis, others, tools, language, mood, guilt, history, existence, and time are just some of the many topics addressed here. Likewise, the innovative way in which such topics are unfolded and discussed becomes apparent in the language with which Heidegger carries out this analysis. Starting with the word Dasein, which is not another name for consciousness, subject, or human being, Heidegger introduces a vocabulary that challenges the reader. We find neologisms alongside commonplace words that are used in quite uncommon senses. We read, for instance, of being in the world, being with, worldliness, thrownness, attunement, temporality, conscience, facticity, everydayness, equipment, anxiety, authenticity, care, objective presence, equiprimordiality, and taking care, to name just a few of the words that need to be listened to carefully. The language of this text frequently needs to be heard in a different register than the one to which one might be accustomed. Meanings are stretched, roots of words are highlighted, small and seemingly insignificant words, for instance, are shown to be complex and in need of careful reflection. Heidegger argued that it is the business of philosophy to preserve the power of the most elemental words. H. 220. Reading Being and Time, one experiences this elemental power of language. Of course, all of this makes the task of one who translates Heidegger especially difficult. Piled atop the usual struggles of translation, there are special difficulties facing the translator of Being and Time. Heidegger's suspicion about the inherited language of philosophizing and his neologisms, which are intended to force the reader to think from a fresh perspective, make the burden of the translator especially challenging. Joan Stambaugh faced these challenges with the insight born of her long connection to Heidegger's work. Thanks to Stambaugh, we have a translation in which one hears something of Heidegger's own voice. Nonetheless, all translation operates in a realm defined by nuance, options, multiple legitimate possibilities, apparent impossibilities, and resonances that complicate every otherwise fine choice. Translation is interpretation. It is also a sort of treason, no matter how deep its fidelity. While I have taken advantage of the last 15 years of commentary on this translation to make modifications to Stambaugh's original translation, there should be no doubt, this is still the Stambaugh translation of Being and Time. It is not possible to give an indication of all of the changes made in this revised edition. However, some general remarks might be helpful. One difference in this new edition is that the German word being translated is frequently identified by being inserted in square brackets. Doing this solves a number of problems such as those arising from the difficulty in distinguishing being, sane from beings, CN. Whenever there was any chance of confusion about the translation of these words, the German words were inserted. Likewise, it is not uncommon for Heidegger to make connections between ideas by having words echo one another. Typically, these echoes cannot be maintained in an English translation. Thus, repetitions in German words like environment or surrounding world, Umwelt, dealings or association, Umgang, circumspection, Umsicht, considerateness, RTLCK-Sicht, tolerance, Nachsicht, Sight, Sicht, nullity, Nichtigkeit, nothingness, Nichts. The not, Nichtheit cannot be repeated in English, but the links that unite these and many other words can at least be made visible even to the reader who does not read German. Greek characters are now used for the Greek words. The lexicon of Greek expressions is available at the end of the book for those who might find a transliteration and translation of many of those words helpful. Heidegger's notes, which were previously published as endnotes, are now footnotes. The marginal comments from Heidegger's own readings of Being and Time are included at the bottom of the page, indicated by symbols, along with the footnotes, indicated by numbers. The numbers in the margins indicate the page number that has been used in the German text since the 7th edition. Most of Stambaugh's translations of keywords remain as before. There is, however, one change that needs to be explained and defended, namely, the decision that Dasein would no longer be written as Dasein. The reason this change needs some comment is simple. As Professor Stambaugh writes in her translator's preface, it was Heidegger's express wish that in future translations the word Dasein should be hyphenated throughout Being and Time. Among the many considerations that have led me to no longer write Dasein with a hyphen, I will note only the following. First, Heidegger expressed his wish in this matter prior to the publication of the final version of Sein and Zeit in his Gesamtausgabe, so he could have made the same change in the German edition. He did not make a change, but continued to write Dasein without a hyphen. This is a translation of Sein and Zeit, not the place for corrections to be made that would move the translation away from the German original. Second, there are a number of places in Being and Time where Heidegger does write Dasein with a hyphen. To write Dasein with a hyphen, in every case, covers over a distinction that Heidegger himself makes and finds significant. Third, in later texts, most notably his Beiträge, Heidegger will write Dasein with a hyphen, reverting to the non-hyphenated form mostly only to speak about Being and Time. There again Heidegger is, in some real sense, distinguishing Dasein from Dasein. Finally, since many scholars writing in English use the German text when writing about Heidegger, English language scholarship has, by and large, not adopted the decision to translate Dasein as Dasein. Professor Stambaugh discussed her translation of Being and Time with Heidegger many times, and rightly followed his wish. but it has become clear over the years that the reasons not to do this are overwhelming. Too many differences are obscured when we do not stay with the practice that Heidegger himself retained in the final edition of Sein and Zeit. For the most part, however, the changes in this revised translation consist of modifications of sentences and other changes that, hopefully, will bring Stambaugh's translation even more in line with Heidegger's original text. Of course, if I have introduced new problems in doing this, I am responsible for those. My intention in making revisions was not to produce a different translation, but to present what I hope will prove to be a somewhat better version of the Stambaugh translation of Being and Time. Heidegger himself thanked Joan Stambaugh for her translation of Being and Time by presenting her with a copy of the poem that is reproduced on the cover of this book. Joan Stambaugh must be thanked yet again, first, for her translation and the contribution that translation has made to Heidegger studies. Second, for giving me permission to make the revisions in this new edition. Translators struggle over every word, and the result is hard-won. A translator who allows her work to be modified by another is truly generous. Thanks are also due to Dr. Hermann Heidegger for his support of this translation from the beginning, as well as for this revised edition. Finally, I have benefited greatly from comments and suggestions offered by colleagues and friends more than I can name here as I have worked through this revised translation of Being and Time. There are many reasons that Being and Time poses special problems for its translator and for the readers of an English language translation. 3 aspects of the text are especially noteworthy and so need to be commented upon here. First, one needs to bear in mind that, in Being and Time, Heidegger has introduced a large number of German neologisms. Words such as Befindlichkeit, which would be readily intelligible to a German reader since it has a clear relation to an everyday German phrase wie befinden sich bitch, how are you doing, appear here as Heidegger's own coinage, and so pose a challenge even to a German reader. Typically, Heidegger's neologisms have strong connections to everyday phrases or words, and so exhibit a curious mix of strangeness and familiarity. Second, Heidegger frequently employs quite common vocabulary in uncommon ways. Here the most visible example is his use of the word Dasein which, besides having a long history as a philosophically term, it is, for example, one of the categories in Hegel's Science of Logic, is a word that belongs to everyday conversation. One of Heidegger's intentions in Being and Time is to reappropriate that word and give it new meaning without completely repudiating its everyday sense. Again, a German reader might find a sort of alchemy of familiarity and strangeness in Heidegger's use of such words. Third, naturally one finds Heidegger using quite traditional philosophical vocabulary in Being and Time, but he goes to great lengths to move such words into new and rather untraditional senses. Words such as Wahrheit, truth, and saying being are only the most obvious examples of the problem a translator and reader face. Such are some of the sorts of translation problems that are especially amplified by the nature of this text. There remain, of course, the usual problems that belong to the project of translating German into English. But these problems, while demanding a certain vigilance on the part of both the translator and the reader, are not insurmountable. Some 3 decades ago, Macquarie and Robinson published a translation of Being and Time, and in so doing were at the forefront of bringing Heidegger's work into English. That translation itself came to shape the way in which Heidegger's work was discussed in England. After 3 decades of translations of Heidegger's other works by a variety of translators, some of the decisions that were made in that early translation of Being and Time might now need to be reconsidered. The present translation attempts to take into account the insights of the past 30 years of Heidegger scholarship in English. This translation was begun some time ago and has undergone changes over the years as colleagues have offered suggestions. Some individual translations will no doubt still provoke controversy, and because Heidegger's language is so rich and multivalent, would likely do so no matter how they were translated. But it is hoped that this translation will remedy some of the infelicities and errors of the previous translation, and open a productive debate about some of the more original and still puzzling language of this text. To that end, a few very brief remarks about some of the terminological decisions may be in order to help orient the reader to some of the choices made here, and to some of the alternative translations that might well be borne in mind by the reader. However, in the end, the translation will need to justify itself in the reading. It was Heidegger's express wish that in future translations the word Dasein should be hyphenated throughout Being and Time, a practice he himself instigated, for example, in Chapter 5 of Division 1. Thus the reader will be less prone to assume he or she understands it to refer to existence, which is the orthodox translation of Dasein, and with that translation surreptitiously bring along all sorts of psychological connotation. It was Heidegger's insight that human being is uncanny. We do not know who, or what that is, although, or perhaps precisely because, we are it. As is the case with German nouns in general, the terms Dasein and Angst, which remain untranslated, retain capitalization. No other English expressions are capitalized, including the term being. Capitalizing being, although it has the dubious merit of treating being as something unique, risks implying that it is some kind of super thing or transcendent being. But Heidegger's use of the word being in no sense refers the word to something like a being, especially not a transcendent being. Heidegger does not want to substantivize this word, yet capitalizing the word in English does tend to imply just that. The later words for being, Irani's appropriation, belonging to other, and does Jevir, the fourfold express relations that first constitute any possible relata or things, and thus confirm this non-substantializing intention. Another peculiarly problematic word is fallen, which does not literally mean falling, but speaks rather of a falling prey to something, the world. In other words, it is a kind of motion that is unable to go anywhere. While one might render the substantive, des verfallen / die Verfallenheit, as ensnarement, I choose to translate it as entanglement to avoid the connotation of a trap. The word Befindlichkeit, which I have translated as attunement, needs some qualification and special comment. Another legitimate translation for this word is disposition. Here one could refer to the French translation which uses disposition. But despite quite compelling reasons to use disposition, I decided that attunement was the better choice, if only because it seems better able to avoid suggesting that there are psychological connotations carried in Heidegger's analysis of Befindlichkeit. The translation of the word Bewandtnis here as relevance also needs a comment. While one might opt for a different translation, namely, situation, it seems that such a choice leaves the meaning of the word too broad and vague, and that it fails to capture the distinction Heidegger makes between Bewandtnis, which has primarily to do with things, and situation, which is more applicable to people. The crucial trio of words Sorge, Besorgen, and Fürsorge was rendered as care, taking care, and concern, respectively. A shift from the previous translation of being and time needs to be noted here. Macquarie and Robinson had used concern as a translation for Besorgen. However, I have chosen to use the word concern as a translation for Fürsorge, which involves human issues. I have translated Besorgen as taking care, as opposed to the Macquarie and Robinson translation of solicitude, because it refers more to errands and matters that one takes care of or settle. Heidegger sometimes uses the word andir with an article, die andir, but for the most part the word appears without an article. I have followed him in this and so use others rather than the other. The emphasis on the other, s, so strongly expressed in Sartre as a threat to subjectivity, is lacking in Heidegger. After all, we belong to others, we are others too. Vorlaufen. Anticipation is perhaps too weak. Macquarie and Robinson's running forward in thought seemed a bit awkward. But it may be the better choice. Nah was consistently rendered as nearness, whereas in earlier versions I often used closeness as well. The word Wiederholung, which I have translated as retrieval, could also be translated as recapitulation, since that word is used in music to refer to what Heidegger seems to intend by Wiederholung. In music, specifically in the sonata form, recapitulation refers to the return of the initial theme after the whole development section. Because of its new place in the piece, that same theme is now heard differently. One final word, which is a departure from the previous translation, needs to be noted. Augenblick, which I have translated as moment, as opposed to Macquarie and Robinson's moment of vision, should help pick up the temporal connotations of the word and also shed some of the almost mythical sense of the previous translation. Here the reader might do well to associate the word with the English expression, in the twinkling of an eye, or the French coup d'oeil. The non-numerical notes at the bottom of the pages are Heidegger's own notes made in the margin on the occasion of subsequent rereading. I wish to thank Dennis Schmidt for his valuable and helpful suggestion. Thanks are due to Theodor Kissel for the lexicon. I also wish to thank the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung for its generous support, enabling me to complete this translation. The text of Being and Time first appeared in the spring of 1927 in the Jahrbuch für Phänomenologie and Phänomenologische Forschung, Vol. VIII, edited by E. Husserl, and it was published simultaneously as a separate volume. The present reprint, which is the 7th edition, is unchanged with respect to the text, but has been newly revised with regard to quotations and punctuation. The page numbers of this reprint agree with those of the earlier editions, except for minor deviation. The designation first half, which previous editions bore, has been deleted. After a quarter century, the second half could no longer be added without the first being presented anew. Nonetheless, its path still remains a necessary one even today, if the question of being is to move our Dasein. For the elucidation of that question, the reader may refer to my Einführung in Die Metaphysik, which is being published by the same press as this text. That work presents the text of a lecture course delivered in the summer semester of 1935. For manifestly, you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being, saying. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed. Do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being, saying? Not at all. It is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being sane. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression being sane? Not at all. So first of all, we must reawaken an understanding for the meaning of this question. The aim of the following treatise is to work out the question of the meaning of being sane, and to do so concretely. The provisional aim is the interpretation of time as the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. But the reasons for making this our aim, the investigations which such a purpose requires, and the path to its achievement call for some introductory remarks.